Alrighty, we are already cooking. We've already got enough people. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. You two know each other, but
A little.
I'm Josh. I'm a big fan, obviously. But can you tell the audience who you are, just so I don't butcher it and do it incorrectly? I'm sure they know too, but just in case.
I'm Rod Johnson. Spring came out of my first book, Expert One-on-One J2EE Design and Development. Even I can't say that.
Sounded just about right.
Still less verbose than the code that it eschewed.
True.
Look at that. People are saying hello. By the way, people, if you're in the chat and you're saying hi, let us know where you're saying hi from. You know, I know it's a worldwide thing. I'm always curious. I love that. Rod and Juergen are actually, well, they're in different places at the moment too.
Yeah. So Rod, anything to add to your introduction?
Well, I guess I continued with Spring for a number of years, and we founded the company, which we sold in 2009. So I kind of haven't been involved in Spring development for 15 years, and I haven't actually been involved with the company for around 12 years. But nevertheless, it's been incredible to see, the quality of the team. And obviously now I'm going to do Juergen's introduction as well. Obviously, this man is absolutely critical. I mean, I think, frankly, I'm going to do this because he's probably going to be too embarrassed if he does it. I can't really think of anyone in open source, except possibly Linus, who has been for so long with a project playing such a crucial role and doing it so incredibly well. I mean, I think the Spring community is as fortunate to have found Juergen as I was fortunate to have found Juergen when he approached me through the forums that Rocks Press set up for my book. And, it's an incredible thing. I mean, the guy is an amazing coder, amazing dedication to the project. And I think that quality bar that we all know and love and rely on around Spring, so much of that is Juergen.
Could not.
Can only say thanks for the compliment. Thanks for the for covering my introduction. But yeah, and it's been a while, right? And where the book that you just mentioned, it dates back to like late 2002. I mean, really quite a while. So yeah, covering quite a few years in between here.
Well, that's 22 years.
It depends on where you count, right? We did this 20th anniversary thing of ours. It's always a matter of from the inception of the project, or where do you start counting? the 0.9 release, the 1.0 release. I guess we count from the 1.0 release here, right? So that gives it a pretty straight 20 years from like March 2004.
It's definitely more than 20 years, though. I mean, personally, I count from the oldest author tag, which I'm pretty sure is something like June 2001. Go look at like B3 or application.
We have some since tag somewhere in there that actually has some date in 2001. which we always left intact just for the historic value of it, right? We never switched it to since a version number, but we kept on some very old files that stayed in the same location. We kept those years in there, or some dates even.
We have so many comments. I'm just flashing these on the screen. I don't know that people are going to be able to. Oh, hey, there's Trouble. There's our friend. So he's Costin. Say hi. Did you see Costin there? And of course, Michael Manila joined us, and there's Matt, and faces new and old. Okay, so you mentioned 22 years since the earliest author tag. I think I've even seen some from 2001, right?
That is 2001.
That almost makes it 23 if that's what you're.
You're
trying to say.
And that was actually Spring MVC stuff. Even more interestingly,
I think it's somewhere in the Red Bay area where you would find those. I'm not 100% sure.
It would be. I think the oldest author tags are probably things like Bean Wrapper and Bean Factory, but true that Spring grew out of the MVC framework. So it's funny because that was the latest bit of what we consider kind of Spring core to have been adopted, right? There were a number of years when everyone was using Spring in the middle tier, but we have to use Struts or whatever else we were using. And there was this feeling, why does Spring have an MVC framework? And of course, there were actually two reasons for that. One was that Struts 1 was a terrible, terrible piece of software. I mean, it was a gratuitously terrible piece of software. But secondly,
that's how you feel.
Spring grew out of the MVC framework. So I'd written an MVC framework in late 99 at ft.com in London that had what we would now call dependency injection, though no one had thought of the name, that initially started for configuration because we had to white label quite a lot of things for different sites. So you could inject using Bean properties, all these primitives, and then it gradually morphed to injecting objects. So I did a clean re-implementation of that for the book, which became the Interface 21 framework, which became Spring. But the funny thing was that the IOC container grew out of the MVC framework, and yet people always thought the MVC framework somehow didn't belong, at least until probably 2007.
Yeah, the Struts Spring Hibernate stack wasn't it a thing back then, right? Lots of Struts usage initially. I do remember that very, very well. Yeah.
Well, I remember that when I left ft.com, which I had to because I had to go back to Australia because my mother was sick, I had heard about this Apache Struts thing, and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I'd love to retire this framework I've written, not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it'll be easier to align on open source. And I had a look at the code and saw that the controller servlet was a singleton. And I thought, we've got 12 controller servlets in production. I mean, this is a joke. Why would you do that? So we did not adopt Struts.
Action servlet, wasn't it? Action servlet, and the cross references. I have lively memories of
so Spring MVC, quite good. But at the time, I was very pleased there was a Struts Spring integration from the Spring side.
It was very popular back in the day. Lots of people using exactly that combination.
Because it allowed me to bring it in
the critical years, in these critical initial years. There was lots of Struts on the Spring middle tier, basically Struts web tier on the Spring middle tier, and Hibernate for persistence purposes. And we kind of orchestrating everything in the middle of it. My own memories also start kind of with Struts because I was sitting in that room in San Francisco at Java 1 where Craig McClanahan announced the first pre-release of Struts and kind of published it the same day. And I remember those stories. I mean, he basically wrote it in a hotel room, bad weather outside or whatever it was, right? And you can kind of argue, well, it showed, right, that it was written in a hotel room, never really refactored from there. But yeah, I mean, Struts did establish a pretty broad ecosystem of Java web environments, right? I mean, whatever it was design-wise and however short its actual peak was, right back in the day when it was so very popular, but everything that followed from there kind of has a bit of a reference point in Struts, right? And kudos to Struts basically for being the first and being a bit of an initiator of Java web frameworks in the day.
It's the first thing that showed me you could apply rigidness and structure to the morass that was the ocean of possibility that was Java, right? So it was the first time I learned about Model 2 MVC was kind of like I learned about dependency injection through Spring. I learned about Model 2 MVC from Struts, and you learn the pattern. You go, okay, well, this is not the best implementation of the pattern, but at least I now know of a pattern to glom onto, and I can just look for something that does it better. I like the pattern. I like the structure. It's like, okay, put this here, put that there, put that there, and now you've got an HTTP endpoint. It's not glorious, but it works, and you can scale it out to a whole team. So I really appreciated that. I just didn't, obviously Spring MVC would very quickly sort of surpass that in terms of ergonomics and then features too.
It wasn't just a good point. It is a good point that Struts was important. Yes, in fairness, I think Struts was the first non-trivial piece of Java open source software that really had a big impact. And that really did change things. I think Struts started that process where a lot of companies thought, oh, we are using open source is critical to us. We've broken that kind of idea. We have to develop everything in-house. So yeah, Struts was a very, very important project, whatever I might say about its architecture. Another thing, in fairness, is as of Spring 1.0, the MVC framework was definitely better than Struts, but it was kind of a bit like Struts without the deficiencies. And it wasn't really until we got to annotations, and I think it was and overhauled it, that it became really nice. I mean, I never loved Spring MVC with Spring 1.0. I thought it was better than the alternatives, but it just felt a bit nasty the way it had to use inherit.
Abstract.
Exactly. That never felt great for me, and I kind of racked my brains trying to think, how can we improve that model? But as soon as you got annotations, it became possible to improve it. And I mean, obviously today it's beautiful.
It is. I have questions. So you mentioned annotations, which we didn't have in Java. Some people may not realize that this has not always been there. It came in Java 5. I remember I've said a million different times, had Spring not come along, I'd be a .NET developer, because they had attributes, which are annotations basically. Back in 2001, I was like, oh, what is this? This is magical. And at the same time, I was wrangling EJB docklet and then X docklet to get Commons annotation style annotations in JavaDoc to do the thing, And I remember we had Commons annotation support in Spring before.
For a while, yeah. Since annotations, I mean, the first annotation support we did was in Spring Framework 1.2, right? At transactional, I think, initially. And the annotations for Spring MVC, at MVC, as we called it back then, came in 2.5, right, in its initial version. So there was a bit of a staged affair. We basically were living and running in a JDK 1.4 based world. Java 5 was out there, but the tooling wasn't quite ready yet. So Java 5 had a bit of a slow uptake initially. So our annotation support came as people actually started to use that sort of model, right? We weren't really trying to do it too early, but yeah, it came together pretty quickly over those initial few years. The original reference for us platform wise was JDK 1.3 even, and then kind of 1.4 is a sort of common platform for the application service back then, and we had to do the best we were able to do back then, right? With whatever JDK 1.4 gave us, that was kind of our mission initially. The best possible programming model you could have on JDK 1.4, and then we moved on from there to embracing all the goodness that Java 5 gave us. So that was an interesting period, right? In the entire Java ecosystem, it was a pretty interesting period because lots of frameworks had a heritage from the pre-Java 5 days.
Yes.
That wasn't unusual at all. We basically all went through the same stages in some form. Hibernate initially, XML-based mapping files all over the place, right? Yeah, that was the thing back then. And I just reminded myself there was web work, the thing that became basically Struts 2 after all. It was also a sort of common, well, a contender at least back then. Ready, it was an upgrade path from Struts 1. It was nothing like Struts 1. It was a completely different framework, just named Struts 2 when they kind of rebranded it as such. But yeah, there was quite some activity in the Java Web Framework space back then. Almost a little JavaScript-like, like different frameworks and constantly evolving and kind of changing their own design in every major release. That we are in a much more stable, on stable grounds right now. We basically you got variations, different web frameworks possibly, but they all agree on so many things that they don't feel as different as the frameworks did back then.
So this brings me to another point. I think those frameworks survived, the frameworks that did survive that primordial soup before Java 5 and are still here today. I think Spring's like one of the only things I can think of that has managed to do that because it kept compatibility to just an unbelievable degree with the older code while introducing new things. And we do that all the time. We have 2 ships or 3 ships that we're navigating. Hi, BBC. We have 2 or 3 things going on at any given time, and we never just outright cut off or deprecate the old thing. Was that, I mean, I know the answer, but that intentionality around backwards compatibility, was that built in from the very beginning, or is it something that grew naturally out of just your aesthetics? Or like, was there a meeting where we said we are going to preserve, like 20 years from now, people are going to be using Spring Framework 6 and they can take their code written against 1.0 and replace the jars with 6.0 and it should still work? Is that like a thing somebody decided or decreed, or is that just because it's so impossibly good and backwards compatible? What was that about? Who had that arrive, that spirit?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that due to the use of dependency injection and also AOP, Spring really does emphasize the use of POJOs. I don't know if people still use the term POJO, but obviously that was the term of the day in like the mid-2000s. And a great deal of your code doesn't know about Spring. Like now you want to inject your business objects, you don't even need any annotations, right? For the most part, you can get constructor injection, which is just a pure Java concept, sits nicely with immutability and best practice. So I think the core ideas of the framework take you a long way towards backward compatibility. And then, of course, it was the discipline of essentially one of the magical things about Spring, I think, was always that we took the community and the users very, very seriously. And this comes down to what is Spring. Spring is not hobbyist open source. Spring is largely made by people who, work all day on Spring, and a community of people who work all day on business critical applications that use Spring. So, it's always been a very, very serious undertaking. And obviously, we needed to consider there are real implications of breakage.
Well done. That actually brings up another point. You mentioned people working on it all day, but you were a small company, right? You were bootstrapped from basically you two and then a few other founders. Well, that's another point before we get too far down the road. You two are the first 2, but there were others that would very quickly then follow. Can you mention those people just as a salute?
Well, there are so many amazing people who were involved in the Spring journey. So as soon as I start mentioning them, we're going to forget people. Juergen and Josh, you can help me out. But, some of the people who came on early were Colin Sampliano. Colin, as I think you mentioned, Josh, did the first cut of at transactional, which was a pretty important feature. Colin, I believe, was involved mainly in the data access side, helping Juergen out at that time. Colin played a very, very important role in founding and growing the training business in North America, which is obviously very important to the success of Spring as an open source project. There was Keith Donald, who wrote Spring Webflow and contributed to various other things. There was, of course, Costin. There was Mark Pollock, Mark Fisher. It's pretty difficult to start going through names. There's so many people, many of whom are still with the project, who've just contributed so much.
Also,
I think of
like Keith Donald, so many things in the web space over the years. Spring Webflow, the bootstrapping of all the portfolio projects that we know right now also happened in this period between like 2005-06 to 2009. Spring Webflow, Spring Integration, then Spring Batch, the Spring Data project. There were so many portfolio projects established by strong project leads in every one of those projects, right? So there are even more people that kind of had took a strong role in leading one of those portfolio projects from their inception onwards. We always had this model that the Spring Framework project basically stayed intact. The way it's actually pretty, scope-wise, it's pretty close to what it initially was, but there was this additional portfolio growing around it, and we basically decided that every one of those should have a life of its own, a release cycle of its own, a strong project lead of its own, a dedicated development team of its own. So just creating those dynamics that we now see in the wider portfolio. And in the end, Spring Boot grew out of kind of out of that model. A couple of years later, we saw Spring Boot as another dedicated project with a dedicated development team, bringing it all together, dependency management wise, and introducing the now common entry point to the Spring ecosystem, right? That we know now. And even Spring Boot is now like 10 years old, right? In the meantime.
And I'm hoping to line up that discussion too. That gets us to because you mentioned the portfolio. We used to talk about the Spring portfolio, which is the ensemble of things that build up top Spring framework itself. And originally when we said Spring, we just meant the framework. And then very quickly there's a CG, which is now Spring Security. Then there's and that's Ben Alex, by the way, of course, for the audience. And we had Spring Integration and Spring Batch, Dave Sire, and then Mark Fisher, but reversed respectively. And then it's all these wonderful things that just sort of crowded.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Spring Webflow and also Spring Web Services. I forgot to mention, like SOAP support, Whistle support, a huge thing back in the day, and it still has a dedicated user base, right? So it's many of those projects kind of found their spot as specialized as they may have initially seemed. Well, to some degree, they still are a little specialized, technology-wise and use case-wise. But that's okay. That's exactly why we did them. The truly common ground is basically in the core facilities, and then every special kind of segment of the market or segment of the user base had got some portfolio project basically in their vicinity. Spring Integration with Spring Batch obviously are special purpose frameworks to some degree, right? Or Spring Web Services. If you don't use SOAP and Whistle, why would you care, right? But if you do SOAP and Whistle, then it's the number one choice in the Spring ecosystem, right? So that's how it works, and that's how it worked back then. That's how it still works today. The introduction in recent years of, say, Spring Cloud or the specialized parts of Spring Cloud, or even, say, WebSocket support, RSocket support. Those were never meant to be mainstream facilities that everyone's going to use. It's for a dedicated audience, for dedicated scenarios, but there it's essential, very useful. Immediately adopted by where it actually makes a difference. And that to me is the Spring portfolio today, basically a collection of portfolio projects with slightly different purposes and target audiences, but a common ground, in the core framework underneath, but also a common style, a common design across the portfolio, a recognizable Spring kind of design to them, right?
Aesthetic.
Yeah, it's hard to actually put that into words, right? Kind of what specifically is that aesthetic, right? But if you look at it, it's kind of still recognizable. There is just everything from naming conventions to the structuring of the programming model to the reuse of core programming model concepts or the analogous facilities, an inspiration from core programming model concepts that is taken to a different domain. There's all of that, right? But it's that overall makes the Spring portfolio what it is today.
Juergen, I would go so far as to say that
I enjoyed seeing that the portfolio grow to what it is today.
I think I was talking to Dave Sire like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I'll never forget this. I said something like, thank goodness for Juergen, and he said something to the effect of, yes, we're all just apostles in his stead, basically. Like this, the portfolio has maintained a consistency and a style because it comes from on high. It starts with Rod, and then of course Juergen has continued it, right? And that aesthetic, that design sense, it's if it wasn't so good in the core, it wouldn't have proliferated. Culture begets culture. I was trying to figure. Oh, look at that! We got hello from China, hi from Denver. Hello, everybody. What was the? Again, you have all these portfolio projects, and I'm back putting my mind back. At some point, you changed the company to become SpringSource. You mentioned Interface 21, but then the company changed names, and you had a slight pivot in direction. You mentioned training a minute ago. So what was the business model? I guess I'm trying to figure out, let's cast our mind to 20 years ago. From my perspective, I'm a grunt trying to get software into production. Spring is saving my bacon. Really, really, really convenient software. But I'm not paying you a penny. I didn't even know how to pay you a penny. You'd written the book, so I didn't bother paying for the training, and didn't need it at the time. And so what was how did you go from, how did you make money by giving away software that was so good and so useful for everybody? And then what was the SpringSource pivot around?
Well, at first we didn't make enough money to pay for it, and that was a difficult learning. And during the process of that learning, I think Juergen went for something like 9 months without getting paid. So we were basically only able to pay founders pretty much what they needed to live on. I think it was fortunate that Juergen had very low expenses and Colin had a little bit of money he'd made from something previously, so didn't need to take that much money out. So initially, the business model was consulting and training. Consulting was trivial to sell because Spring was very popular. Obviously, people wanted to pay good money for Spring consulting, even at that time. But consulting doesn't scale as a business. It's relatively low margin. And if somebody is sitting all day with a client delivering consulting, you can't really expect them indefinitely to go home and work all night on open source software. So consulting was not really a viable solution. So training proved to be dramatically better. Training is higher margin. It was also higher risk. I still remember spending half a day where I was on a weekend in London, walking around thinking, "Ooh, am I going to commit?" I think it was £4,000 to rent a facility for the first Spring training, and this just seemed scary because it was £4,000 for the room for 4 days. Plus, I think we needed to organize a number of laptops. It added up to, and the training business fairly quickly took off in both Europe and North America, and it was definitely better. But again, it really was hard to combine with engineering. So you're burning out a lot of people. I mean, people were traveling pretty much every week to deliver a 4-day training course in a different city. And it wasn't generating enough money that we could really have an engineering team dedicated. I think Juergen, by this point in time, Juergen was able to work full-time on Spring, and I think by this point in time we were actually able to pay him a salary. But I think the dedicated engineering team really at that point in time, and everyone else, including myself, was delivering training and consulting, and you know, it was surprising. We really thought that would work, but it didn't quite work. It was closer to working than the consulting model had been, but it wasn't quite working. And we looked at the things we wanted to do with Spring 2.0. So we wanted to overhaul the AOP framework. We wanted to move from DTDs to schema so that we could have the configuration be far more extensible. There was a whole range of things that needed to be done, and we were really struggling to fund that and also keep ourselves afloat. I mean, there were times when our financial situation was, you know, really, really precarious. So at that point, we made the decision that the future had to be being a product company. That, you know, there is a reason that Accenture and even many, you know, all the big consultancies, even some of them having good people, they don't produce a lot of software that has a great deal of value, because that model just doesn't work to do that. And that's when we realized that in order to get ourselves to be a product company, we would have to, it could not be accomplished without an injection of cash. So there was no way that we could develop, like, there was no way we could really continue to develop the framework where it needed to go, let alone build additional IP that we could charge for without injection of cash. So it was pretty clear we had to raise money. And that is where somebody who I'm sure most people in the Spring community have not heard of played an important role, Neelan Choksi, who we recruited as COO. And, you know, Neelan and I led the charge in raising money. And that obviously changed the trajectory of the company. And I think in the long term, it was necessary and the right thing for the open source community. The road to making money, of course, was very difficult. So initially we tried selling Spring Support. Didn't really work as a product. And I'm sure Juergen has heard this, but it still amuses me. Some of our sales reps would literally come to me, several of them did this, and say, can you please make Juergen take a holiday? Because I am so sick of hearing from customers, well, you know, all the problems we have are with WebSphere. We never have a bug in Spring. We don't need support for Spring. So it's just too good. So that was definitely a challenge. And I mean, part of it was that Spring was very high quality software, so people didn't perceive the need for support. The other problem is that open source support isn't really a real business. I'm pretty skeptical about that for any project. So we realized that the way to go was essentially open core style things, and also that people were pretty resolute about not paying for anything that they perceived as being in the development space. So although actually by this point, most of their stack was inside Spring instead of WebSphere, and they were only using WebSphere kind of because somebody told them they had to, they felt that it was normal to pay for WebSphere and not normal to pay for Spring. So that's where we introduced TC Server, and it was much, much easier to monetize what people perceived as a traditionally monetized product.
Infrastructure.
PM server, right?
Yes.
Yes. Years.
Yes,
So,
that was a product in search of a problem.
I was going to say, by the way, you were mentioning all the Spring portfolio projects earlier. Are we not going to mention Spring Rich? That had potential.
Rich client? I mean,
yeah, the Rich client.
Yeah, we tried a lot. We tried so many things. Like the problem being, of course, that it was the very same small group of engineers trying all those things, right? So we really stretched ourselves thin going in these different directions. I mean, DM Server took significant engineering resources away from the classic Spring projects. So they were when Spring Integration started, right? Mark Fisher kind of disappearing from the Spring Framework project, then serving as the Spring Integration project lead, really left a bit of a gap in the core project, of course. I mean, but that was the way we worked back then, and everyone was on the road for parts of the time. I mean, I used to do consulting up until 2008 in some form. I mean, I gradually reduced it a little because it's of course in competition with your responsibilities as a project lead of a framework if you're on the road all the time, right? It just isn't sustainable. I mean, initially it's kind of interesting because you kind of see your stuff in the field, right? You see what people do with it. You see what they struggle with. You kind of, you feel it. You feel their pain, also their joy sometimes, but a lot of the pain in particular. So you can really work with that. You can really take that back to engineering. I did appreciate that part back then. But as a model, as a business model, or even as a personal way of working, as a work style, it's not sustainable, right? It's totally always in competition with other priorities, other responsibilities, and the separation of engineering and kind of customer services. It took us quite a few years to really make that happen in the end. But yeah, that's an essential step to take. You need a dedicated engineering group, dedicated engineers that really basically get up in the morning and the first thing that they do is they check the issue tracker, basically, right? You need people with that kind of mindset and that kind of everyday work style. And not getting up in the morning and thinking I need to go to the airport, right? So yeah, that was critical. But ever since at least 2008 or so, we kind of had that, and VMware then really, VMware had this strong engineering tradition, of course, not much of a customer services tradition, you could argue. So we kind of came in with our business model, took engineering roles, and then like we had this training business and training customers and consulting customers, and then we had to find a way to continue those customer services. But it was a good step to take, a bit more of a traditional engineering culture, kind of forming the development teams here on our side, and that's basically the way we have it ever since, right? So we basically have dedicated engineers. We keep a bit of a tradition that we still go out to conferences and occasionally just user group visits, whatever, customer visits occasionally. But most of the time, most of our work time we spend on actual engineering tasks, right? Like release planning, like issue tracker responses, like actual coding, of course, right? So that's the way it needs to be. There's no other way to have sustainable development over 2 decades other than that kind of focus.
Yeah, I think the outward-facing element is important, though, that kind of contact, because I remember early on talking to the application server vendors about transaction management. I remember talking to someone in the UK in WebSphere's transaction team. Really nice guy, I forget his name. He wanted to be helpful, but he was genuinely baffled when he realized what we were trying to do. And he asked me, why would anyone want to do transactions without EJB? Yeah, and by this point in time, if he had actually spent time with WebSphere customers, he would have fully understood that many WebSphere customers were totally done with using EJBs for anything. And yet they were in that situation where they weren't yet ready or weren't yet allowed to throw out WebSphere. But it was interesting that if you looked at the core people in the WebSphere team building that functionality, they had no idea. I'm sure there must have been people in the broader IBM team who knew, but it clearly wasn't getting propagated back, and they obviously weren't doing user groups or doing the kind of engagements we were.
Monopoly.
That really shows, right? I mean, it showed on our side, this pragmatic this insight into where people actually are and what they want to do with our stuff was really a very immediate feedback cycle, right? That really inspired what we did next. That even inspired us to be very open, to any kind of feature requests in existing feature lines. We basically wanted to make people happy and keep them happy using our facilities, whatever their use case was and whatever their tasks was, as long as it's kind of sounded reasonable in our ears. We tended to be very open. We still are very open, right? To bring in refinements. There might be just a little thing missing, right? This overloaded method over here, this SPI method over there, a customization option in yet another place, really making the deal for someone, right? Really enabling them to do what they mean to do, what they need to do. And those little that love for the details and the configuration options, the customizability that we basically have all over the place. People learned pretty quickly that empowers them, that really gives them a degree of influence on the stack that the application servers never even intended to give them, right? So and to this day we see a lot of customization out there. There's always, it's not very common. It's not like everyone doing the same customization. It's very individual customizations, everyone being in a different situation, integrating a different stack, having a different business requirement, kind of sneaking pretty deep into the technical stack in some form, and our arrangement lets them have it the way they need to have it. And I think that attitude was always important.
It is pretty predictable as well where Spring will let you customize something. I had an interesting experience a few weeks ago. I had upgraded to, I think, the 0.8 Spring.ai release or pre-release instead of snapshots. And there was one thing where the use of a retry template for LLM calls was hard-coded. The values were hard-coded to reasonable values. And I was looking at it thinking, I clearly need to change that. You know what? I'm going to make my first contribution to a Spring project for 15 years. I'll put in a pull request. But I thought before I do that, I'll just go on to the snapshot again just to say whether they've done it. Guess what? They've done it. Because, it was just the kind of thing that is not Spring, right? You're not ever going to have something like that that's hard-coded because you're going to allow people to be able to customize it. So, Spring's so good, I didn't need to contribute.
I saw a comment fly by, and I wanted to touch on that. You talked about having a outward-facing presence, and obviously one couldn't more heartily agree with that idea than I. And that's one of the reasons why when I joined, it was very natural for me to sort of slide into the rhythm, because you were already doing, to a large extent, that outward-facing advocacy stuff. And it was just very natural for me to then slot right in. Another thing that you did early on to encourage and foster the community was to also make documentation second to none, right? And somebody mentioned that here, this one. The document, people don't, again, it's the context. It's really good documentation, no matter what, although goodness knows people complain, because I always complain, and it's getting better all the time. We have Entora and all that. But at the time, JBoss was charging for their documentation. I mean, people don't realize what a weird world we lived in. Open source was not de facto or de rigueur back then. You would be rejected for using open source in 2001, perhaps. And then if you got open source code, maybe there was no documentation. You had to pay for that. It's a very totally different world. Everything you did was not conventional back then. So that was really good. Part two was that. Oh, nuts! I forgot the rest. Oh well, talk amongst yourselves. I'll think about it.
The documentation was definitely really important. That was actually, a lot of the core documentation was written by the core team. But there were also people who didn't contribute as much to the code who played a big role, like Aleph Aronson. I mean, he wasn't committed, but he played a big role early on in the documentation. There was Isabel, I can't remember her surname. She was involved for a while and played quite a significant role in the documentation. And yeah, that was definitely critical to the success of the project.
So also it's showing to this day, since this really extensive documentation also needs to be maintained. We learned that quite the hard way over the years, that it keeps being a significant investment, right? To maintain up-to-date documentation alongside the actual framework offering. And it's, I mean, there's always legacy in the documentation as well. Things are being explained in a sort of late 2000s mindset, and you really need to actively go in there and rework it to provide more of a modern day perspective on things, in terms of the recommendations and the priorities between different options that we give, different styles that we're offering. So yeah, but that's a significant. So it's actually part of the engineering effort, right? It's basically half of the time you might actually write some code, but the other half of the time you you think about that code and try to document it, try to revisit the existing documentation in particular, and make sure that it kind of reflects the current state of the framework, right? The state of the art that the framework is trying to provide these days.
I remember my second question.
Because it's not an automatic process, right? It's a very manual process. You really need to get in there and spend quality time with the documentation.
You mentioned customization, super important. I use it all the time, but there was a whole debate around convention over configuration. We talked about what I perceive as being the borderline influence of .NET on Java in the early 2000s. But I think there was also some influence from Ruby on Rails, for better or for worse, right? There was certainly a large discussion that erupted in the Java community circa 2004, 2005 around convention over configuration. And at the time, I remember you, Juergen, and our pal Adam Bean discussing the sort of back and forth on convention over configuration or versus configuration, or a little bit of both. And I think Spring has always we've always tipped the scale more on configuration, but we had some conventions. And now, as we move forward in time, I think it's fair to say we have a good amount of convention as well. How is that? Am I wrong? Did any of that impact your thinking, or is it just all? What was your take on that, both of you?
Well, I think really you asked earlier about backward compatibility. I think one of the ways we've handled that as well is having different layers, right? Different elements. So if you look conceptually, Spring Boot is a completely different thing from Spring Framework. I mean, Spring Boot obviously is nothing without Spring Framework, but it is this layer of convention over configuration, which doesn't require changes in the framework. And I think that gives us the best of both worlds. So, unlike, say, something like Ruby on Rails, there is that layer underneath that is more flexible and more rigorous, but you can actually have a lot of the benefits of convention over configuration. I think that, there's so many parts now where we are using convention, right? Take, for example, repository interfaces and Spring Data. There's a whole bunch of things where there's pretty extensive use of configuration, convention, sorry. And in fact, some of those things are directly influenced by Ruby on Rails. I think this brings us to another thing that has been quite successful for Spring, which is we have been willing over the years to adopt good ideas that other people came up with. So in the very, very early days, if people remember Pico Container, Pico Container was all about constructor injection, and Spring was about setter injection. And at that point in time, constructor injection was barely viable because the language support was inadequate to do constructor injection in a really maintainable way. But nevertheless, we added constructor injection. We didn't choose to fight a war over this. We added constructor injection because some people like that. And, we acknowledged the Pico Container team had a good idea around this. And over time, constructor injection, as the language improved, has obviously become the preferred approach. Another example, Juice. Annotations, well, this is a rather sad moment because obviously poor Bob Lee was murdered last year. I mean, that was just awful. But with Bob's idea of annotation-driven injection, we adopted that. And again, we acknowledged that, good ideas came from, both inside and outside Spring. As you mentioned, those ideas from .NET, ideas later from Ruby on Rails. So I think that has been something that's been important to the success of Spring. And it also comes down to a professional and respectful attitude. Like, we always took the view that somebody else has a good idea, we're going to adopt it and we're going to acknowledge it. So pretty much the opposite of, say, the way the J2EE people and the JBoss people always approach Spring, which is we're going to simultaneously slag off this thing and then do really inferior takes on what they've achieved. We would pay the appropriate respect to people who come up with good ideas and do our damnedest to, create the best possible implementation we could.
And that is also something that I think is truly remarkable. I have not met. So I borderline accosted you, Rod, the first time we met. Like, I jumped out at you like a cat from behind a column, looking for some help, trying to get a approval for endorsed by Spring Source, whatever, for this book I was writing on Spring. And you were just exceedingly lovely. And I think about that all the time. And my first interaction with, Rod Johnson, was not one of security. It was more like just this incredibly helpful, indulgent and patient human being just trying to help the community out. And that's just, it's from the top on down. Every person on the Spring team has been, there's a reason all of us check Stack Overflow and check the whatever forums we can, and we're on Twitter. We just want to help, and it's just this it's a mentality, certainly, and you can't take that for granted. Try going to some other. There are, even today. You mentioned Linus earlier. Again, I'm pretty sure he's not on Stack Overflow answering questions. Save Joe about Linux and all that. I like Linux, but I'm just saying there's a culture that you've.
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
If he answered the question, you wouldn't like the answer mostly.
Probably epithet laden, Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. People take that for granted. I don't. I'm so grateful for that. I know what it's like to have been. What was that word? I can't use it without sounding like I'm appropriating another. Slagged off. Is that a word?
Off.
Yeah.
Slag off. I guess British English. Yeah, my language, which is very confused.
Is that something I can use in polite company? Because we're
not
live right
really.
now.
It's like I don't know. It's somewhere. It's certainly not like obscene, but
okay,
refined. I'd steer clear of it.
Yeah. All right. So I have some. Okay. I don't know where we are in the timeline. We couldn't possibly hope to cover everything. I'm not even going to try. I do have some nonsense questions that I would just like to put out there because I do kind of wonder.
Let's look at some of the questions that we get.
By the way, somebody mentioned this. The old Spring PHP bullet board, whatever, forums were great. And yes, they were. They were springsource.org and all that stuff, right? Okay, great point. Questions like alternate universe. If you hadn't created Spring, what do either of you think you'd be doing right now? I kind of wonder that myself. Like, you could have been like handsome trillionaires, but instead you just decided to create Spring. Why? Like, what's the why do this? It's a labor of love, obviously, but did you ever think about that? What could have been? Cost it. Devoted.
I don't know. To be honest, if Spring hadn't been created and become successful and very good, I seriously wonder what the state of enterprise Java would have been. Because I wouldn't be surprised if by the mid-2000s I would have been doing .NET. I think that things were not going very well for
No.
enterprise Java at all. I don't know what I think it's highly likely that I would have continued, down the route of being a very well-paid consulting architect. .NET didn't have a tremendous open source culture at that time. I mean, things have gotten better since. So yeah, I suspect for me, I would have continued doing what I was doing, and would probably be working at a bank, running technology at a bank or something. And I think I would
writing in-house frameworks for
less rewarding career.
There was a thing back then, right? Everyone doing in-house frameworks. It's kind of my own background as well. Pre-Spring was working on in-house infrastructure, but in the initial few years, I mean, we were constantly encountering in-house frameworks of one kind or the other wherever we went. And in many ways, our offering, Spring overall, was kind of on a mission to replace those in-house frameworks or to become the foundation of those in-house frameworks. There are still in-house frameworks in many large organizations out there, but these days they are not ground up, built in-house. They are built on Spring Framework itself, or even on Spring Boot these days, right? So there's still this notion of architecture teams, infrastructure teams in organizations, but their job is different these days, right? They assemble a stack based on open source components, very often with Spring as a foundation, rather than writing everything in-house themselves, which they did back in those days, right, in 2004, 2005. So that was interesting to see. But on the point of the Java ecosystem kind of surviving, enterprise Java surviving to this day, there's definitely this factor of competition of innovation of distributed innovation in a wider ecosystem that kind of came in those mid-2000s efforts, that challenging the traditional assumptions that everyone had, and we certainly played a role in this, right? But there's this continuation of the Java ecosystem, the modern day evolution of the Java platform. After it moved to Oracle, basically from Java 8 onwards, this kind of innovation in the Java platform is great to see, and it wasn't taken for granted. There's many platforms, many programming models out there that kind of had their time. They had their couple of years, their decade maybe, and then they faded away. We've seen so many things come and go. I mean, not just Struts that really had a bit of a short life in retrospect, but also Ruby on Rails kind of we saw many things reach their peak and then kind of fade away from there. In many ways,
it ran out of rails.
It's not taken for granted that the Java ecosystem became what it is today, and these days there's a co-evolution, a stronger and more proactive co-evolution of the Java platform and the frameworks on top, right? So back in the day, it was the Java platform did something and basically ignored everyone else, and the frameworks were trying to do the best they could on top of what we've been given in the Java platform itself, in the JDK itself. These days, there's more of a co-evolution.
Symbiosis.
Ever since Java 8, really, there's a co-evolution with our good relationship with the Java platform group at Oracle. Lasts for a very long time already, and I very much appreciate that, and it's really showing, right? There's this co-evolution really benefits everyone in many ways. That there's we had that with the introduction of back then lambdas and functional interfaces, this convention-based model that really allowed us to have JDBC template as it was, and the callbacks that it accepted became natural functional interfaces. The way they introduced that really worked well. It really re-empowered some of our facilities with the use of Lambda expressions. That was great to see, right? There wasn't a huge breaking point where we had to throw away the traditional APIs and introduce new ones for Lambda expressions. There was really a pretty seamless path, and that came out of some of this early co-evolution, or it's just people talking to each other between the platform group and the framework groups. And And that's today it's CDS, Project Light, and whatever comes out of this, it's a very collaborative affair where the whole point of those facilities and those investments in the Java platform are to empower frameworks to arrive at better startup time. It's like we are the immediate target of those efforts, basically. They really want to make modern day frameworks successful on the Java platform, because Java today is basically the enterprise platform, right? So many other uses of Java have been tried. They came and they went. But Java as a server-side platform remains, right? That's where it's so strong. That's where it has this huge audience out there, this huge developer base and install base out there.
Yeah.
Rod and I were just texting each other the other day about some feature in Java that was just really nice, and surprisingly so. It just happens all the time. We're like, wow, this is really well thought out. It feels like a different language now,
Well, I mean, certainly, actually, I'll answer a question here in the chat. What am I doing these days?
Yes.
Currently, I am building a chat platform in Java with Spring, obviously Spring Boot, and Spring AI, and Java 22, and yeah, it's really interesting to build my first serious Java code since literally probably 2008. I probably wrote no code at all. I was just doing purely business things from about 2008 to probably 2014. Then I've written a lot of TypeScript, Scala, also Python. This is the last probably 3 months is the first time I've been seriously writing Java code and seriously using Spring for 15 years or so. And I'm really, really enjoying it. It's a good experience.
And yeah, I lay that at the feet of Juergen and the Java team. There's just so much. There's a wonderful symbiosis. And you talk about a chat platform, and is there any AI in there? Like this does bring us to a question I had, which is, of the new things, what are you most excited about? Somebody asked us, by the way, what about Android? I hate to tell you, we actually did have a Spring for Android project. Do we still have that, Juergen? Is that even supported?
It's really? not much of a thing. It didn't really take off hard, and it turned out not to be as necessary as we might have initially thought. Right, in a modern day architecture, there's common ground in the communication between the Android app and the server side app that doesn't really require framework specific support on the client side necessarily. And we know what we're good at, right? It's like really empowering the server side of a system. So that's what we chose to focus on. We had so many things. We didn't just do Android for a while. We had Spring.net for quite a few years. But in the end, we focused on where the majority of our audience is and where basically our core competence is. So I think that's a sensible outcome. There's so much to do on the server side, right? We kind of rediscovered all of the possibilities and all of the demand that there is for more special purpose arrangements on the server side, and that keeps us busy to this day, right? Of course, it keeps a pretty large development team busy in all corners of the server side space.
Absolutely, and even you mentioned there's a lot more to do. That's 100% true. But there's also sometimes a little bit less to do. And one of the things that we used to have on the server side that you could probably still use, but I'm not sure what the use case is anymore, is Spring Mobile, right? The server side content negotiation for Android or iPhone. Not even that, actually precursor to that, very old mobile devices. You could, I don't know if it's still supported, but
even modern day communication with a mobile device is basically based on different communication patterns, right? That don't really require what we had back then. There's many things that kind of had their time. They had a few years, but then they faded away, even in our ecosystem. That's also part of our job to some degree, to choose what's worth an investment, right? A continued investment. And this changed over the years, of course.
Yeah.
But it never. There's parts that we always had a clear, not only focus, but I would argue like a degree of thought leadership on that we never gave up, right? So it's kind of that's obviously a core competence.
Right.
And this aforementioned co-evolution, the symbiosis with the Java platform is also core to what we do these days, and it's also something that keeps me excited about things, right? It's like this. There's always inspiration coming from different sides. Sometimes it's from the architectural sides, what we see in the real world from certain customers, certain users, but often it's also inspiration that comes from the language, from the core libraries, from some efforts that they do at the Java platform level that open up new possibilities for framework designers. And we are usually very aware of what's happening there and trying to do the best we can with everything we're being given by the Java platform team in the language, in the core libraries, in the Java runtime arrangement, right? The way that Java is being deployed these days is quite different from even 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, right? So it's like there's never been a hard revolution where everything was different from one day to the next. But if you take the entire evolution of the Java platforms and the frameworks on top, the Spring ecosystem on top, if you take it for like those entire 20 years from where it started and where it is now, and what was common back then and what is common now, there's a huge difference, right? But from my perspective, at least the way I naively see it, there's a pretty clear path of evolution from what it was back then to where it is right now. A continuity all the way through.
Well, I think it comes back to the fact that Spring has a strong conceptual basis, right? The core ideas that we laid out originally with Spring, you see in all these different parts of the Spring ecosystem today. You can recognize some of those core concepts appearing, which means that Spring has easily been able to adapt to the change from an application server hosted environment to a Tomcat hosted environment to a microservices environment. Those concepts are valuable even in very different scenarios. And this is why one of the projects I'm very excited about is Spring AI, because I think bringing that model to interacting with LLMs actually makes a ton of sense. And I think Spring's got a valuable part to play in that story.
Absolutely. You kind of backtracking here a little bit, Juergen, you mentioned, and by the way, I love Spring AI too, so that's great. But Juergen, you mentioned the symbiosis with Java, the collaboration with the Java platform team. But we've also, and obviously I'm a big fan of the Java team, but we've also had some influences from, we had Spring Scala for a couple of years. We've always had good Groovy integration. We have a very good Kotlin integration. And that dynamic, that the language informs what we can do, right? And so one of the things I remember,
we're being inspired by the Java platform itself, but also by other initiatives in the Java ecosystem, right? Like Kotlin, of course, coming in basically totally from the side, but really having provided a lot of inspiration to us. The nullability arrangement we have these days, in the entire core framework code base, the way we deal with nullable versus non-nullable arguments and return values is totally inspired by the way Kotlin does it, and kind of translating this idea to Java based on nullability annotations instead of nullable types. But there was really a strong inspiration and a really fine collaboration with the Kotlin team at JetBrains in the Spring Framework 5 period in particular, but it goes on ever since, right? So we're also co-evolving with Kotlin to some degree. Kotlin certainly found its audience there in the meantime, and we have a strong, dedicated Kotlin user base that choose to use Kotlin with Spring and writing entire systems in Kotlin. So and we had that with Groovy, of course, before, and there was also a bit of a specific arrangement we've never been shy of kind of getting closer with some of those initiatives, not just abstractly keeping them somewhere in our ecosystem, but really embracing them, right? Our Kotlin integration is pretty deep. We have Kotlin extensions all over the framework that really make the Kotlin usage more idiomatic than it would be if you're just calling traditional Java APIs from Kotlin. We had that with Ruby back then as well in quite a few ways. So that's also part of what I see as part of the Spring mindset, right? Or the recipe for success that we had is that we've never taken a very abstract perspective on things. We've taken Hibernate as what it is. We take Group Kotlin as what it is. We try to be a very natural citizen in that kind of stack. We've tried that with Scala, but it never really went.
Yeah, I take this question.
It doesn't always turn out as natural as you would think it is. And we also react to that, right? We need to find an audience that is willing to use that stuff in combination. If there's not much of an audience there that's willing to combine those things, then it's also not worth like a continued investment on our side. So that's why we fade out. Why Scala basically faded away a little from the Spring ecosystem over the years.
Well, I think, I mean, some things work, some things don't. Spring Scala just never found a market. And the reasons for that are various. The main reason is the reason that Scala ultimately didn't find a market. I think somebody asked my views on Scala. I gave a keynote at Scala Days in
2012,
New York, 2012, 2013, something like that. And I think it was 2013. Called Scala 2018, and I was talking about what I thought would have to occur for Scala to become a mainstream language. Sadly, I think quite a lot of those things in that talk were proven to be true and didn't go the way they should have gone. So, for example, a lack of binary compatibility, the wholesale rejection of the Java ecosystem. There were a range of things that unfortunately hindered Scala from achieving its potential. And now I think you've got Java, as the commenter noted. Java is adding some nicer features. Kotlin, obviously, to a large extent, is eaten Scala's lunch because it's done a lot of the things about making the language more concise. I really loved Scala as a language. And honestly, even today, I could probably take any Java code you like, rewrite it in Scala and make it more elegant and more readable. But unfortunately, that is not what happens in a Scala project. In a Scala project, because you can literally do anything in Scala, somebody is going to come along, discover that, realize that they can make every single thing a monad, and, create this wholly impenetrable thing, throw in things like implicits and truly scary stuff. So I think, unfortunately, it hasn't been terribly well suited for large-scale software development. I've got a lot of respect for Martin and a lot of people involved in the project. So, I think there's some great things that they did, but sadly it is not, I don't think it's proven to be that good from a practical point of view.
I remember your keynote. I was there. You actually wrote some poetry in Scala that compiled, right? And it was like Perl. It's a very different thing. We got a nice comment here. People are starting companies on Java and Spring. That's awesome. You mentioned the features in this commenter mentioned the nice new features in Java as late competing with Scala. Obviously, I think there's a whole functional program because the JVM community just really hasn't. I don't know. We haven't really gone all in on the functional stuff. And I think if that were there, maybe Scala would have a bigger. It would be more pervasive, because there's a whole side of it that's just not tapped, unfortunately, because it's just we don't know to look for it, so we don't know what we're missing.
Well, it's partly that, I think for a lot of developers from, say, a background of language like Java, going to functional programming are going to go through the collections model. And if you looked at the Scala use of the Scala collections library, it was just beautiful. Whereas you look at collections in Java and they're pretty nasty, like lifting to a stream and back again. So that personally is the thing that bugs me most about Java at this point. And I truly hope that at some point those libraries are improved.
Victor Klang, who was one of he was the deputy CTO at Lightbend TypeSafe, and he's worked on akka for years and years, and of course he helped contribute the futures support in Scala. So he's now a Java language architect at Oracle, and one of the things he just contributed is the gatherers, right? Which is it's going to make, hopefully it'll make it easier to plug some of the gaps you find in the stream abstraction in Java, which is now already 10 years old, which blows my mind.
Yeah, we also had our kind of share functional programming in reactive, right? I mean, it's like the idea Webflex or generally reactive programming is probably the strongest embodiment of functional programming that the Java ecosystem ever went through, but not necessarily to everyone's liking, right? So it's right. There's been a bit of a backlash as well from like functional programming styles in Java with virtual threads. We're going back to a little more preferring imperative programming if we can, right?
Right.
But it's very much a preference of programming style, and to some degree, our wider offering, right, is always kind of there's options that we provide, there's different flavors of the programming model that we provide, and then we see how much uptake they get in the community. And fundamentally, the decision is not made on our side of what becomes popular, what remains popular over the years. The decision is in the wider community, right? Whatever gets continued adoption is then kind of what it is, what the Java ecosystem is going to be like going forward. And there's always inspiration from those things. Even the things that kind of faded away served as a strong inspiration infrastructurally in terms of their programming style and in many ways, like say in the Scala ecosystem, akka, or the actor model. Even if it didn't turn out to be like the mainstream way of programming these days, it served as an inspiration for many things. So all of these things had a lot of goodness that came out of them, language-wise, framework-wise. But it's kind of interesting to see that many of those kind of reached their peak and then kind of clearly faded away from there. Certainly was the case with the Scala ecosystem, the way I kind of perceived it, the way I observed it.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, well,
no worries. We actually have plenty of questions and comments. I barely get the time to read through those.
Well, and we're
fairness to Scala, I don't know that the vision for Scala was the kind of vision that, say, I would have liked to see in Scala. It was coming from a different place. And I mean, I think to a large degree, it introduced some ideas, demonstrated they could be put really well into an object-oriented language. So, I think there was also that research angle with Scala, which you'd have to call a success.
Yeah. We were kind of winding down here. We're on the home stretch here, and it's time for the usual required by law retrospective navel gazing kind of questions. Okay, so bear with me here. Don't just like cut the feed and then run away. These are it's by law. We have to ask these questions. So let's see a couple questions. First of all, time capsule. Imagine you're sending a message to developers 20 years from now about the Spring framework. What would you say? Right? That's a not retrospective. That's a prospective or something. Don't everybody raise your hand at once now.
Look, I think Spring will definitely be out there in 20 years.
Quantum Spring.
Yeah. I don't know that anybody's going to be writing code in Java or any present high-level language, though. I mean, I think by that point in time, we will be talking in our natural languages to systems that will write code for us. So, yep, Spring will still be in there, but I don't think you'll be interacting with it.
Juergen?
You might still be seeing and refining it. Yeah. Well, with 20 years, you're really far beyond my usual horizon, my planning horizon. I'm actually, in particular among the team, I guess, pretty forward looking in what I do, at least for part of it. But forward looking in the sense of maybe 2 years or so, where you can make certain predictions and where there are certain things that are on a path to productization in those 2 years, so you can make reasonable bets and educated assumptions about it. But beyond that, it's really hard. On the other hand, no, we have 20 years behind us. So obviously, I would hope that this degree of continuity that we had up until this point kind of continues from here. Evolving along with the Java platform, and there's quite a few things that are already lining up there, and I can totally see this co-evolving from here over quite a few years. I know as a community and as a Java ecosystem community, I hope that we remain as tight as we are. There's a strong sense of kind of moving along together here in this community, even if there's always a risk of a bit of fracturing with the Java 8 or Java EE 8 versus Jakarta EE. That sort of split always had a bit of a risk of basically leaving part of the community behind. I hope we can get over this, and that the Java ecosystem remains as willing to move along with the times and the innovation in this space, the evolution in this space, not choosing to stay behind on a platform from 10 years ago. So I really hope that we can move forward together here for the next couple of years, for the next 10 years, for the next 20 years, any period, right? But if we keep up this sense of kind of evolving and moving forward together, I think that would be a huge win, and I would love to see this.
Huge. I don't know. I feel like I have other questions. Just the one I've always wondered, which one of you is Paul and which one of you is John? Very important question.
I think I'm definitely John, in the sense that John did some things that didn't work, whereas Juergen seldom does anything that doesn't work.
Yeah, that's much.
Definitely, if there's any code that's like I am the walrus, it would be mine rather than Juergen's.
Yeah, I'm not sure that comparison really flows very well, but yeah, I might be more of a Paul here, a Paul McCartney. That could be. Yeah, it's we always had those comparisons. It's kind of funny that there's always this. We had this reference point in back with the iPhones and Androids, when there's always this duality of offerings, and then you compare yourself. Is this more of an iPhone solution or more of an Android solution? An Android-like and an iPhone-like solution. It's doesn't always work so well in terms of comparisons. But in the meantime, we became our own reference point there anyway. So. I don't think there's much of a need to compare. But since you brought up the Beatles comparison, Rod, we always had this notion of, if we started a band, or if we wouldn't have started this together, we would have started a band together. We had that back in the days at Spring Experience, I remember. So maybe it's not as far-fetched then that we would take on these kinds of roles.
Oh, that'd be so good. That you mentioned the camaraderie, you mentioned that community, and now we're talking about the band. And here, 20 years, amazing. Congrats, everybody. It's been honored for me to look at this. We got some. Oh, here's our friend Ram Nivas, another legend.
Yeah. So a couple of the posters we should call out here, by the way. Costin Lau made a big contribution to various Spring projects, and Ram Nivas also is core engineer. And yep.
There's a lot of people that were in that original generation that I don't think we've mentioned, because again, to do so would be by definition to forget somebody. not intentionally, of course, but Rob Harrop comes to mind, obviously. Ben Alex, Colin, we've talked about a couple of times at least thus far. Who else? Aleph, we mentioned him, right? Surely you too, of course. That first wave, and then you get the Dave Sayers and the Mark Fishers and Dr. Sayers and Dr. Pollocks of the world. And
there's actually something that we haven't spoken of in terms of community. We mentioned, obviously, we've been talking about code, we've been talking about documentation, how important it is. The third thing is forums and community support. And in the world before Stack Overflow, we had the Spring forums. And for example, at different times, I know Costin was the #1 poster, then Ben Alex, I can't remember which order it was #1 poster. And I mean, these people were posting literally thousands of times, giving really high quality answers to user questions. And that was, you know, vitally important, especially when then you start to get users thinking, I can answer this other question. Right? Like, I am so grateful that Costin's answered all these questions. I'm not going to expect Costin to do it because I can answer this question. So it had this kind of virtuous cascade. But
by example.
Very important. Dimitri.
Hey, Dimitri.
Hi, Dimitri. Also, I believe you were up there in those top posters, I think, as well, in the very early days.
And also our friend from Peru, I can see his kind face. He was the spring champion in 2010. You remember that? We gave him an award.
Yeah, I know. Oh, whose name starts with an E? I know Edu.
Spring recipe.
Edu.
That's Ed. No, that's a different one. You're thinking of Edu Melendez.
Oh, okay.
I'm thinking of 15 years ago. Oh dear, I wonder what his.
We've had so many close collaborators and people who were closely involved for quite a period, right? Over those years, and I appreciate every one of them for as long as we had we had the contributions. Many people who were never part of the team, but external contributors, but very active. And obviously that only works as far as they find the time or can donate the time to do so. But it's still the case with people tracking every single commit that we do on the core framework and kind of finding and catching every glitch that we have, down to spelling errors somewhere in the Java doc, or missing an add since tag, right? We immediately get a pull request if we forget to add an add since tag to a newly introduced method. There are still people so closely watching what we're doing, and it's basically a whole community of reviewers out there, of immediate reviewers, that adds a lot to the quality of the code base in its own right.
Manuel Jordan. That's the
yes. Yeah.
The spring champ. Oh, thank goodness I remembered. Yeah, he was the most prolific contributor at the time. We gave him that award to the springsource.org forums. Yeah, just sorry. Yeah, the community makes it all work, and it's because people don't realize the Spring team itself is actually fairly small. I mean, the Spring framework, but then you've got these 15 other projects that we steer, but it's still relatively small. I don't know what our official team count is. You can go to spring.io/team and kind of suss for yourself what the numbers are. But it's a very small group considering the outsized impact. So a lot of that
was never particularly large, right? I mean, it's I've seen all sorts of sizes from say 1.5 to up to like 8, right? It's always been in pretty tight bounds. But well, I wouldn't want to have it any other way, really. If the team had to grow larger than that, that's a signal, a sign that we should maybe spin off a portfolio project from it with a dedicated team. That's exactly what we did over the years, anyway. Otherwise, that would have been the case. That a single team would have grown. But we always opted for a separate dedicated team with its own like 3, 4, 5 people instead.
A lot of important things have been done by pretty small teams. Like, for example, in the days of WebLogic, although we were never fans of EGB or most of J2EE, WebLogic was a really nice product. I mean, if you wanted to implement that spec, they did a great job at it. That was a pretty small team. The core team for the core of WebLogic was really pretty small. Similarly, I believe that the team who does the core of the Oracle database is actually fairly small.
Really?
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of obviously tens of thousands of people who do more peripheral things, but I do believe that they have a fairly small core team.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I mean, obviously we have borrowed hands as well from like the Spring framework. Is still the core. It's it's the thing around everything. Everything else is a satellite. But sometimes we borrow. Sometimes there's like I remember for the AOT push, we had to pull people in, sort of to bring that to life. It was a all hands on deck kind of effort. Same thing for the reactive theme, which by the way is a Juergenism.
There have been those really portfolio-wide initiatives where everyone worked towards the same goal. But that's not actually all too often, right? In certain periods that was necessary, but most of the time, the portfolio projects operate pretty independently, which is a value in its own right. To be able to do this, find your own path, your own focus, your priorities, your features for the next iteration.
It only works because you're so good about including everybody. Like you said, you wake up and presumably everybody else on the team wakes up and the first thing you do is check the issues. Like
you don't all wake up at the same time, though, right? As you can see, it's dark in the meantime. But I mean, that's the other part we really cultivated over the years is a distributed team arrangement with very tight interactions, right? We collaborate very closely and very tightly with a distributed team where most of the core team works from home and in very different locations, different geographies. So being able to pull that off and keep it up is a challenge in its own right? It's not actually easy to do this, but we really developed our way of managing that kind of process. This balance between guidance and independently working on things is a fine line to walk, but it's a continuing challenge, right? It's like you need to rebalance this every year, every now and then. But yep, that's how we work today. And of course, many people are with us even in recent years. In the past 10 years, right? We've had a lot of people that were with us for most of the time. And the core framework team is basically largely the same core people ever since like 2014. And that's true for many parts of the Spring portfolio, that we have a lot of people really kind of on the particular job for many years in sequence. And of course, that's showing, right? There's a strong influence every single one of those has. And it shows in kind of our design language that it's the same people really involved there, and also then accepting the contributions, rolling them in, learning from them, getting inspired from them. Kind of, I guess that's how I would define my job, somewhere in between these tasks, these duties and responsibilities, right? It's like it's not just you're an architect or you're a developer on a framework. You're really kind of orchestrating the evolution of an open source project with so many stakeholders and so many contributors. That's what I enjoy about it.
I think an interesting thing about Spring as both a project and a company is it was global from day one. Like, when we think about the some of the people we've mentioned at the time, I'm obviously Australian, but I was living in London at the time when Spring was founded. Juergen was in Austria. Keith was in Florida, Colin was in Toronto, Ben Alex was in Sydney, Costin was in Romania, Dave Sire was in the UK. There was, from the very, very early days, a kind of global reach. And I think that was very helpful in a number of ways. I think it was very helpful culturally, and I think it was very helpful in terms of community growth, because there was always somebody who was awake and responding to things.
Which brings us to another, like, logistically, this would have been a very difficult meeting to pull off, but for the fact that Dr. Johnson here is actually in San Francisco in the same city as I am at the moment. So therefore we're only juggling. Sorry?
I can point to your building. I can't see it. Like, it's not very far away.
Right. And I can do the same. And so, but this would have been an async conversation. Were you still in Oz at the moment? And
Jürgen, it really helps to be in the same place after all, right?
Europe. Yeah, exactly. So I really appreciate, Jürgen, especially. He's the one who had to concede his evening hours for
I'm an evening person. Don't worry.
I really appreciate it. I look, we could go forever. I would love to go forever, but in deference to the fact that, to the reality that it is late for Jürgen here. Are you two on the internet? Do you want to be found? And if so, where can people find you?
Well, I have started tweeting again recently after many years. So you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @springrod, so not difficult to remember.
Yeah, I guess I still have my @springjürgen Twitter handle, but I'm not an active Twitter user. I've never actually been a very active Twitter user, and I'm basically not opening it at this point. So I'm not easy to reach there. I guess my most active online presence is on GitHub, after all, right? So the easiest way to start a conversation with me is to create a GitHub issue on the Spring Framework project and discuss the matter at hand. Otherwise, of course, there's the more traditional communication channels such as email. But yeah, I mean, GitHub really proves to be a collaborative tool after all. I learned to love it over the years, to very much appreciate the interactiveness that even GitHub gives us. And of course, it's also, you can kind of read up on the conversation. Others can get involved. So it's not a one-off thing. It's really a collaboration in the open, right, in the public. And we had
CVS, then we moved to Subversion, and I remember submitting patches. This is a thing I think a lot of people will take for granted now, but we used to have to create a manual patch and then submit it. And then we moved to Git, but even there we weren't doing GitHub. We were doing our own for like a year. We had our own service. I forget. I don't remember what it's called now. It wasn't GitLab.
It makes a lot of sense that the community largely agrees on GitHub there these days. It is very useful. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time looking into other open source projects, commenting there, projects that we integrate, projects that we align with, and having all of this so easily accessible and so easy to contribute to, right? So easy to comment on. Yeah, that's huge. It really changed the way that we collaborate in open source here.
Yeah, is it because Spring was already immensely popular in the very beginning, right? And it had a good open source ethos, but to that point, has GitHub, has it ratcheted up the contributions, for example, the collaboration?
Well, I mean, I think it's a wholly different category of collaboration, right? It's like, previously we had a lot of code dropped our way somewhere on Jira, embedded in there, and you can kind of copy it out of there. And now, of course, these days with commenting on commits, quite a few people do this, or sending a pull request our way. All of these things are really much more immediate. So GitHub really changed the way we collaborate on code there, for sure. Even among ourselves, or among the wider team. But in particular with contributors out there in the community.
Amazing. All right. Anything else we want to leave the people with? And that goes to you as well, audience. Speak now, forever hold your peace.
I very much enjoyed also the comments and seeing a couple of familiar names reappearing. That's a bit of a blast from the past in some cases, right? But that's exactly why we're here. It's just great to be here after 20 years and still seeing so much engagement from everyone from the old days and the new days.
Yeah, well earned admiration for you both. Okay, all right, everybody. Thank you.
Setting it up.
Oh, yep. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.